Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author.
In today's episode, we're off to North Africa to dissect the Desert Fox's last battle in the field and the US Army's baptism of fire against the Wehrmacht. A campaign that sealed the fate of the Axis in Africa and that some have controversially nicknamed Tunisgrad. Jesse, good to be back. Another week, another episode. Here we are. As we said, this time we're off to North Africa, a continent, a campaign that we haven't really looked at in great detail so far, and that has so much to offer. And so we're jumping right in there to look at what you might say is obviously and clearly the end of this whole campaign. So the fight in and around Tunis in Tunisia. So before we can actually look at what goes on there and why this campaign is called Tunisgrad, and before we analyze the defeat of the Axis powers there, I think, as always, what we need to do is take a step back and have a look at the context. How and why do Germans, Italians, and Brits and Americans and a small Greek contingent and other people end up in that part of the world fighting against each other? So, Jesse, have you got any insights that you can share?
Well, I have one insight off the bat, which I think is, I realized as you were speaking that we're kind of tackling the North African campaign in reverse, since this is pretty much the end of it and we haven't yet dealt with it. I think in Austria they call that Arschlings, but I won't, for the censors out there, in the English-speaking world, I won't translate that directly, but it's from the backside first. So,
I haven't heard that one before. That's very good. Good old Austrians. You have to love them. There
we're cultured people. In any case. So, folks, what we're going to do for today is we're going to concentrate on the last phase of this North African campaign, as Matthias mentioned, which means basically January, February to May 1943, when things are getting very squishy for the Axis powers in Tunisia. Tunisia, as some of you may know, is a French possession at this time and before, but of course, France has been completely occupied by the Germans starting in 1942. And the situation is this. In late 1942, the whole strategic situation in North Africa changes. And we're constantly going to be talking about things happening in the east of Tunisia and things happening to the west of Tunisia. That's kind of, if you think about Tunisia, it's going to be in a vice grip from east and west. So if you turn to the east, you have Libya, then you have Egypt, and in late 1942, Montgomery wins a significant victory at El Alamein, a famous victory, and he is pushing then all the way from Egypt through Libya, pretty much right up to the border with Tunisia. So that's the situation that's happening on the eastern side of the Mediterranean and North Africa. On the western side, you have Algeria and then Morocco and then the Atlantic Ocean. And that's where in late 1942, Operation Torch takes place. And don't worry, folks, these are all future episodes. So if you're worrying that I'm skipping it over now and it's your favorite operation of the entire war, we will revisit it. But in late 1942, US and British troops land on the coast of these French possessions, and they move towards the east. So that's the other pincer kind of occupying all these parts of French North Africa to the west of Tunisia. And they then arrive in early 1943 on the western border of Tunisia. So that's what you have. You have Montgomery and the British 8th Army, which has a lot of other people in it, New Zealanders, Indians, Gurkhas, some Free French. They're moving in, possibly the Greeks that Matthias mentioned, I'm not sure. They're moving in, they're on the border of Tunisia to the east. And then you have the Americans and the Brits who are on the border with Algeria and Tunisia to the west. And that's kind of the little bottleneck that the Axis find themselves in early 1943. Matthias, What did I overlook?
I think it is all there. As you say, there's lots of detail when you talk about the landings as well. You look at Torch, but that's all for a different and very fascinating episode. Perhaps suffices to say that in the planning there, and I don't want to talk too much about Torch because, as we've now said a number of times, it's a different episode. But in the planning, the Allies are actually quite worried because, as you have said, this is still French-controlled territory. So both Tunisia, Algeria, and northern Morocco is under French control because that is Vichy France. And this is not occupied by the Germans at that particular time, only happens later on. And actually, when the Allies land, there is quite some fighting. Because the French troops actually put up resistance. But again, that's a different story. But it does play into what we're looking at. Because when we now look at the Axis side, as you already said, well, the Axis troops are now between, rock and a hard place. So they're being pushed back in the east, Montgomery and the British Eighth Army pushing the Germans back. This had happened before when you go to the other campaigns and battles in North Africa. So that in itself probably doesn't have to worry you too much, you might say, because it's a very mobile war. However, the fear that you're now getting cut off from the West forces their landing as well, of course, that is very, very worrying to the Germans and to the Italians, who, of course, let's face it, at that time, in the Axis campaign, still have supreme command in North Africa. We keep talking about the Afrika Korps, Panzergruppe Afrika, all these things, but actually, it is in the Axis chain of commands, the Italians that hold all the strings. In reality, very different. But what happened was, for example, Rommel, the famous desert fox, had to go to the Italians to ask permission to do things. This is being played out in North Africa and in Tunisia as well. So they look at this and this is really worrying. So if the Allies are now very quick and manage to push from the west into Tunisia and manage to occupy the ports there, then the Axis forces are done. And they know this. So they are trying to establish defensive positions. They're trying to pull their troops back. They also started to bring in lots of troops now from Italy, from Northern Europe. And this is really interesting because from the Axis point of view, in some ways, you might say, the operational picture has actually improved. Because before that, fighting somewhere in Egypt or on the Egypt border, you had to bring in troops into Italian ports in Libya and then transport them across these very, 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 sandy, not particularly well-built roads. Lots of ships got sunk, lorries being shot up by British strafing plane. One member of my family, he was a dispatch rider. He was shot in the head in North Africa by a Spitfire, you can see. So there's bit of a family connection there as well. This has changed now to a degree because now you can use Tunis and the ports there, and they are very close to Italy, to Sicily. So that, in a way, logistically, makes it easier for the Axis, unless the Allies now really start to push. But the problem is the Allies don't. It's one of the prime examples of not particular decisive Allied campaigning. It's one of the big problems that you find in the British and also the American camps all the way through the war. They're not keen on taking chances. They're not very daring. As a German after-action report says, they're very predictable. Say that's the problem. If they'd really pushed, they could have seized Tunis and the campaign would have been over very quickly, probably already in November, because this campaign really starts on the 17th of November. However, and we'll look at the detail in a minute, they don't, and that means they have to fight a very, very extended and, by North African standards, also very bloody and brutal campaign, which goes all the way into May 1943. Let's talk a little bit more perhaps about the Allied plans. I already said, well, they're a bit slow, but why are they slow? What are the original plans? What hampers them? Why do they not manage to achieve operational success very quickly?
Well, I think one interesting detail about the Axis buildup, before we move back to the Allies here for a moment, one very interesting detail, because the campaign has sometimes been nicknamed Tunisgrad, there's a lot of criticism about that, but we can get into that a little bit later. At this earlier stage, the Germans, during this buildup, they do in fact divert some transport aircraft to bring material and supplies to Tunisia that had originally been earmarked to help with the relief efforts in the Stalingrad pocket. So there is a tiny little connection there that I think is kind of interesting. So as far as the Allies go, You're right. I think that if they had been a little bit more aggressive, they might have seen some better results because, of course, in the West, this combined Anglo-British force is much closer to the key ports of Bizerte and Tunis in northern Tunisia, these Mediterranean ports. The Axis position depends on those, but they don't move that quickly. Eisenhower, who's, at least to me, he's not known as a particularly aggressive-minded commander. I mean, he goes later in the war, he insists on this broad front strategy in France and Western Europe, which is quite plodding, not so dramatic, not so risk-taking. But here, he actually argued for a quicker move. But the British are the ones who say, no, we don't want to rush in on our own. We want to wait until Monty can attack simultaneously from the other side of Tunisia. And of course, he who says Monty does not necessarily say risk and speed. He says, meticulous, measured advances. And so this is one of the reasons why the Allies don't kind of kick things off earlier than they do. And the Axis then tries to take advantage of that. So they are planning. The two German commanders are von Arnim and Rommel. They each have command of one army, one panzer army. And they're already making plans saying basically before the Allies can unite and hit us at the same time, we know that they outnumber us. We know that they have superior logistic abilities to us. Well, we'd better hit one before Monty arrives. And that's how we get a lot of the more dramatic actions in the campaign. But before we get to the action, I'll let you fill in the gaps in my little summary there.
Well, I think another point that is very important and perhaps to a degree sometimes also slightly overlooked, at least in the general history of this particular campaign, is leadership and leadership issues. You already talked a little bit about the two German commanders, who, of course, well, at least Rommel is probably known to every listener here. We've all heard of the Desert Fox. Von Arnim, also a very experienced commander. Of course, he was brought in to replace another chap, Nerich. And this guy, this commander in particular, was a very experienced tank commander from the Eastern Front. And particularly the German reinforcements that are now poured into Tunisia are all combat experienced troops. So they know how to do business because there is a lot of Eastern Front experience. You do not really find that to the same degree in the Allied camp. We already said in the opening sentence, it's the first time in this campaign that the Americans are getting blooded and meet the Germans and also the Italians in battle. You also have political tensions. So, for example, when the Allies land and the French finally, after about 3 days of fighting, put up their hands and either surrender to the Allies or perhaps even join their cause, there's a pact is struck, or a deal is struck with the French, and the French forces are put under Allied command. The French, for example, insist that they would not be commanded by British officers. And that goes back, of course, to long-standing French-British rivalry, and of course, one thing that in the English-speaking world probably no one remembers, but it is things like Dunkirk, where the French thought that the British had sacrificed the French military. Whether it's true or not, different discussion, but that was the feeling. And of course, the sinking of the French fleet in 1940. So these were events that were still extremely raw in the French mind. This is why you have some troops actually putting up very stiff resistance, at least for a day or two. So they do not want to be commanded by British troops. That, of course, can be a bit of a problem. You then have teething problems in the relationship between the British and the Americans. And there are a number of reports from units informations during this campaign that we simply had no idea what we're supposed to be doing because we got conflicting orders from army group down to corps and then to division or what have you. And say the command structure was really, really, not that well oiled in the Allied camp. You also have personality issues. Again, you can look at it from all sorts of different aspects and explain why people behave the way they do. But when you look, for example, at Kenneth Anderson, who was the commander of the First Army, so he's a British officer, he was very heavily criticized after the campaign for the conduct of it. He won it, so that is actually impressive in itself. And we look at the outcome of the battle, of course, later on. But the way it was done, the casualties that the Allies had to sustain, and the slow advance and approach. The blame for that was very much put at his feet. And it's interesting when you look at some of the characteristics or how people described him, to give you one or two quotes perhaps. So Eisenhower, he said about him, so he's a gallant Scot, devoted to duty and absolutely selfless, honest and straightforward. He was blunt, at times to the point of rudeness. And this trait, curiously enough, seemed to bring him into conflict with his British confreres more than it did with Americans. His real difficulty was shyness. He was not a popular type, but had a real respect for his fighting heart. Even his most severe critic must find it difficult to discount the smashing victory he finally attained in Tunisia. So shy, but also very blunt. And this is one thing that British people, British listeners, forgive me, are not. You're not blunt. That's a very Scottish thing to do. So you can see this attitude does not go down well in the mess. And if you're very blunt, but also shy, that is perhaps a slightly unfortunate combination, you might say. You then look at what Alexander Montgomery had to say about him. Well, Montgomery, of course, you have to be careful because he was very good at self-promoting. He was very good at stabbing his military colleagues in the back. So you always have to take things with a pinch of salt. A very, very difficult character, Montgomery. So he said, for example, in March 1943, to Alexander, said it is obvious that Anderson is completely unfit to command any army, and later described him as a good plain cook.
Shots fired.
So that's not particularly great. So that's not an A star. You might say perhaps to a degree you can also understand where this is coming from, because the largest formation he had commanded up to this stage was actually brigade. And suddenly he's given command of an army. So you can see all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems that you can find there. In the Axis camp, you also have some issues that is mainly to do with the German-Italian relationship. That is difficult. You will see when you look at some of the particular actions that we're going to be looking at in a minute that you also get frictions amongst the German commanders, but they're not as bad, as influential, as perhaps even decisive, you might say, as they are in the Allied camp.
Yeah, I think von Arnim and Rommel, there are moments where they really don't get along, where they argue over the resources that are going to be allotted and so on and so forth. We'll come to a few examples of that. It does reach the point, though, where Kesselring, who's the sort of theater commander, does need to intervene to resolve some of the issues between them. So the Axis are no strangers to internal dissent either. Just as a quick reminder, in the course of going through all of this Anderson character is the commander of the first Anglo-American army, that is the one approaching Tunisia from the west, just so we keep all our ducks in order. One other little element in terms of Allied preparation and challenges is the state of U.S. troops. You mentioned that they have not had that much experience, nor have their officers. And some exercises in 1941 really revealed, late 1941, they really revealed some command and control issues, essentially some quality issues with the U.S. Army. And we're going to see how these play out. Leadership issues, training issues, they're kind of revealed in these big exercises in the U.S. I think it was in Louisiana. They had a big mass series of exercises. And this is the first time they're going to be really tested. And some of those weaknesses are going to show. In fact, and I just can't wait for this. Forgive me, Matthias, but this is coming a little bit before, out of order. But I cannot wait to chuck this out there for you listeners. Now that we've offended all of the Brits by saying how Monty was such a difficult character, I'm going to offend all of the Americans through Erwin Rommel, who said on the topic of American greenness, so lack of experience, he referred to the Americans in this campaign as Britain's Italians, because he felt that they were so inexperienced and their battlefield performance at first anyway was one that he compared with the Italians. So apologies to our American listeners out there. It wasn't me. It was Rommel. Not saying as a Canadian, I don't find that very entertaining, but it was not me.
Well, we now have to find something about the Germans because we've practically offended everybody now, except for the Germans. Well, we need to find something bad about them too, otherwise it's getting a bit unfair.
Well,
here.
they lose. They lose. They get their behinds handed to them in this campaign. It's not easy, but that's how it works in the end. So, why don't we dive into the actual fighting? That's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And as I say, the Germans / Italians are the ones who strike first. Monty is methodically bringing up his forces to the border of Tunisia on the east in Libya. And the Germans have a defensive line there called the Mareth line. There are some old French forts. So they're kind of holding that area, and it's not under immediate threat, which means that they're going to use their forces to strike towards the west. And both von Armin's army and Rommel's army are both planning on launching an offensive, and they do. Von Arnim's operation starts in February, and it's called Spring Wind, Frühlingswind. Has such a nice name. Feels like it's the scent of a car deodorizer or something. It's not like a huge military campaign. But in any case, he launches this attack. It strikes American forces near a place called Sidi Bouzid, and things don't go that well for the Americans. They're taken by surprise. There's a famous episode where the commander of a battalion, I think his name is Thomas Drake, he's under so much pressure. The usual command and control is breaking down, and he writes a note that he sends by runner back saying his battalion is surrounded. The Germans have air superiority, because at this stage, the Germans still have something like 800 Luftwaffe fighters ready to go in Tunisia, and that allows them to get air superiority if they so choose at a particular spot. And this is what happens in this first attack by von Arnim. And this American commander writes a note on a piece of toilet paper describing the situation. That's how desperate it is. That's how disorganized things are under this kind of pressure around this place called Sidi Bouzid. There's a small US counterattack, doesn't go well, lose quite a few tanks, and US troops, well, let's say withdraw in haste, if we're going to be charitable, but they get out of there because their position is untenable. So that's kind of the start of this controversial experience of the US fighting the Germans for the first time.
This is now, perhaps you might say, the first and probably only time in this entire theater during the entire war that the Axis powers, it's mainly the Germans really, have air superiority, because, as I said earlier, the geostrategic situation has shifted a little bit. So from where they are now in Tunisia, it's only about 150 kilometers to Sicily. So it's much easier to supply the troops, to bring in reinforcements, to fly over plains. And because the Allies are quite slow to react, it takes them about 2 weeks to put a task force together, a naval task force, to start attacking Axis convoys. In the first 2 weeks, not a single Axis ship is being sunk. So for the first time in a long, long time, the Axis powers are now beginning to, in inverted commas, enjoy the wealth of man and material that had always lacked in previous campaigns. So perhaps a bit of an explanation again as to why this goes so well. And of course, in addition to the things we've already mentioned, you've got German troops that are combat experienced, quite a few of them coming from the Eastern Front. They've been doing proper operational maneuver warfare fighting for quite some time. And they now hit these American forces. And of course, where they attack is very, very important as well, because again, when you go back to the geography we've already talked about, you've got two ways into Tunisia, towards Tunis. Tunis is the prize, isn't it? Because that is the big harbor. So you managed to get to Tunis and you've won. And Tunis sits in the northeastern part of Tunisia. You can come in through the coastal roads, go through the hills and mountains there. This in the area is where these counterattacks are happening. And then you've got them in the southeast, the so-called Mareth line. You already mentioned it. So these are the two ways in. If you manage to hold, from a German or Axis perspective, the Allies there, yes, you are in a bit of a pocket situation, but as long as you're still being resupplied through the air or via the sea, you can hold this position indefinitely. This is the idea that Hitler has at that particular time. This is why he pushes so many troops in there. As you already said, were troops that were supposed to be going to the Eastern Front. The first of a batch of the new Tiger tanks is sent there. So when you go to Bovington, the tank museum in the UK today, probably most of our British listeners will have been there. There, of course, is one of the last remaining Tiger tanks still in action. Go to Tankfest, you will see it driving around. You can climb on it and I don't know what else. That one, as far as I know, came from North Africa, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see there is it's quite interesting what the Germans do. So up to this point, they hadn't really spent an awful lot of time on North Africa. We get very excited about Rommel in North Africa, the Africa Corps. It's great, isn't it? Hurrah, hurrah. It's a corps. To begin with, it's 2 divisions. While you have about 160 divisions fighting on the Eastern Front. So it puts it in perspective. It's only now when it's basically nearly too late, at least from the operational strategic point of view. This is where they start pumping material and men in there because they realize if North Africa is lost, that will have a very detrimental effect on the Axis war effort because that threatens Italy. And this is why you now have these tactical and to a degree operational actions by the Germans that you've just explained. The first of them that actually in the early stages go really well for the Axis and particularly the German forces. Had they had more troops, you might say it would have been a rerun of 1941, 1942, so driving the Allies back even further. It doesn't come to that for a number of reasons. To a degree, that's Allied indirect fire, artillery is being used. Once the Allies have secured air bases, the pendulum swings towards the side of the Allies with regards to air power as well. And yes, the Germans and the Axis powers are strong, but the Allies also have got lots of men and in particular material. And in the further episodes and the future episodes of this particular campaign, this really shows. So tactical ability and dominance of the Germans in the end checked by material and the use of material on the Allied side. So again, a bit of a broader picture, but let's go back to what's to where we are and look like at the tactical operation. So you've already explained the first one. So give us a clue about the second of so Operation Morgenluft. Morning again, where you said it sounds
Again,
a little
it's
bit
car
like some sort of
deodorant.
air freshener, doesn't
Yeah.
it? It does, yeah, very, very true. Yeah. Sounds a bit minty to me. There we are. Yeah.
An air freshener. Thank you. I forgot the term. Yes, it sounds like a car air freshener. Morning air, Morgenluft. This is Rommel's push in the south to the south of von Arnim, where he's attacking. Von Arnim has attacked towards Sidi Bouzid and pushed the Americans back, caught them by surprise. Rommel then attacks a bit to the south. He also pushes the Americans back, but many parts of Tunisia are fairly mountainous. I mean, we're not talking Himalayan-style peaks, but it's a terrain that, on the whole, makes it difficult to really break through and move very easily. That kind of terrain also, of course, tends to favor the defensive. And at the moment, it's the Allies who are on the defensive. So Rommel's Morgenluft operation, it does push the Americans back, but he doesn't pursue with his usual kind of dash as he maybe would in the Libyan desert. He's a lot slower, and this allows the American troops to recover and to take up new positions a bit to the west, but still in this mountain range. If memory serves, it's called the Dorsal Mountains in Tunisia. So they're still kind of holding a line, let's say. Now, from the Axis point of view, you've achieved a few objectives. At this stage, you are pressuring this Western force, and Monty has still not arrived to pressure your rear, if we're looking at it from the Axis point of view. But now there's a bit of a disagreement at this stage between Rommel and von Arnim, because they now have a choice, right? Okay, so we've initially pushed back the Allied positions. How are we going to make this count? How are we going to take this beyond a local victory that has sort of dislocated some local positions? How are we really going to cripple the Allied position in Western Tunisia? Rommel has a much more ambitious idea for that. He wants to be given control of von Arnim's tanks. Now, this is never a recipe for a good relationship between two generals when one is basically saying to the high command, yeah, I want all that guy's tanks to do a bunch of cool stuff. But that's what Rommel essentially says. And he's looking for almost like a Battle of the Bulge style hook to the west and then north to the coast, so that he would essentially cut off most of the Allied forces in Western Tunisia by breaking through and then moving up to the coast behind them. That's kind of Rommel's big idea. Von Arnim, I guess from his point of view, you'd say, well, maybe he's a bit more pragmatic. He also wants to penetrate through Allied lines, but he doesn't think that such an ambitious operation is really going to work. He wants to just break through behind them, capture some very important supply depots and transportation hubs, and essentially lame the Western Allied force, kind of cripple their ability to launch offensives of their own. So you do have this kind of different vision, one more risky, one more conservative. In the end, there's the usual compromise half solution. Rommel gets command of von Arnim's armor, but there's going to be no big encirclement. They're just going to try to break through and capture these important supply areas. That results, of course, in more dramatic action with the Americans, but I'll flip it over to you to finish setting the stage before we get to the big moment of Casarine Pass.
Yeah, absolutely. You might say in many ways, this is the one chance that the Axis forces have in this area to really turn the tide. And this is time for, you might say, bold ideas, bold movements, bold plans. The problem again here is that you already mentioned, you've got these tensions also in the German camp. You've got very different characters here. And again, what I've said earlier, it's basically and eventually the Italians who decide what happens. We tend to completely overlook that very often. So, for example, Rommel comes up with this new revised plan in which he says, well, this is what we can do. You mentioned the hook. So we can actually really inflict some damage here on the Allies. And this plan is signed off by the Comando Supremo, so the Italian High Command, on the 19th of February at around midday-ish. And as you've already said, it's a compromise solution. And Rommel is actually appalled because we could achieve so much more. But because it is eventually a decision by the Comando Supremo, so the Italian High Command, who is an overall command of this theater, that decides that Rommel would get the 2 tank divisions, so that's the 10th and the 21st, from von Arnim, but that is it. And Rommel says that's not enough for the big breakthrough. That's it's great for a break-in, but it will not really turn the tide. So we could have achieved so much more, but we can't. And you could see how von Arnim also, as then the battle that we'll be looking at in a minute unfolds, is actually very, very slow to act. He's very static. So he's more of a defensive expert than going on to the offensive. So you can see there are issues here and there are problems. So in the end, the idea they come up with is, yes, we launched the attack. Yes, we're going to push the Allies back. It's probably not going to be the big game changer, but hopefully we'll be able to seize some of the supply depots. And also, this is very, very important, recapture some of the airfields that the Allies have now got in their hands, because it is to a large degree also about the air war. And fast forward, look, for example, to what happens in Normandy. We probably all know this, the idea that Rommel has, he's always worried about the air because that's his experience from North Africa, fighting in particular, of course, in the early stages against the British. So that means that then in February, basically on the 19th of February, Rommel orders so basically Africa calls it the 2 divisions that he's got now, and there's assault group to attack from Feriana, a small place, towards the Casarine Pass. And this is now perhaps the most crucial, most definitely the best now action of this entire battle. Let's call it a campaign. So if you know nothing else about Tunisia, about 1943 North Africa, you might have heard of this one. It is still a very, very popular one, for example, with British Army audiences. When they go to North Africa to study the war there, they will always spend a couple of days looking at the fighting at the Casarine Pass, because it is actually quite interesting, and you can learn a lot from it, even for war fighting today. So, Jesse, what actually happens there? Why is it so famous? What's the underlying story?
Well, I'll sketch it out in general terms, because admittedly, I am not a super expert on Casarine Pass, but the pass is important, as is another place called, now my Tunisian Arabic is not particularly good here, so forgive me, any Tunisian listeners, if I'm butchering some other place names. But there are kind of 2 routes that the Axis are interested in breaking through to get to these critical supply bases. One is the Casarine Pass, and one is a place called Zbiba or Zbeiba. And those are kind of the 2 focus points, or if you want to get very fancy, the 2 foci of this operation. The assault against Zbiba doesn't go particularly well. So the troops there, the Allied troops there, managed to resist the initial Axis attempts to break through, which means that there are some Axis troops then available to exploit a more advantageous position down at Casarine Pass. One of the reasons why Casarine Pass goes the way it goes is because there's not that many US combat troops in that area. A lot of the troops who are there are from other non-combat parts of the army, like engineers and so on and so forth. I mean, they have like a battery of French 75s in support of them. So it's not like the elite of the US Army is trying to protect Casarine Pass. Even so, and now here I'm going to try to give the US credit where it's due. This is a very difficult situation. I don't think British or Canadian troops in similar circumstance with similar experience would have performed necessarily better than the Americans do, to be fair. They do give the Germans somewhat of a hard time. The first German attempt at forcing their way through this pass, it's a kind of a valley pass, right? So it's lower and there are heights on either side of it. So it's a good position to defend, but of course the defending force is inferior to the German attacking force. Nonetheless, the first German attempt at the pass fails. Then they decide, okay, we're going to try to go up the heights on either side. And if we can then dominate the heights, we can fire down on the Americans in the pass, and then we'll break it open. But that doesn't go according to plan either. And so the Americans are able to defend those heights as well. So Casarine is not just an American failure. There is very serious and effective resistance at the beginning by the Americans. But pressure builds, and on the 20th of February, the US infantry begins to retreat. That French artillery support runs out of ammunition, spikes the guns. They leave as well. So then you kind of have some American armor that's caught without proper infantry support. The British actually send a small armored reinforcement force, I think it's called Gore Force, to come and help because they figure, well, we're starting to lose this pass. The Americans can't hold against this pressure. But now the German tanks, those experienced German tanks, are really pushing their way in and through the pass. They basically defeat this British force as well. So Brits out there, listeners, before you start to get smug about the Americans losing the pass, your relief force also didn't do so well. So it was a difficult situation against that particular German force. That's kind of a very basic overview of the back and forth at the Casarine Pass, but I'll leave it to Matthias to kind of give it a few flourishes.
One thing that is really interesting, and you've highlighted and brought this out, is that we are constantly giving the Allies a hard time. And actually, I've seen it in one of the comments. I was called, what was it called? A Brits hater, because I'm quite critical sometimes. So I thought, oh, there we go. But actually, I think what is interesting here is we tend to concentrate very much at German tactical success. And you have already said that even that doesn't go 100% well for the Germans. So there are issues, there are problems. The original attack, the first attack that goes in, is not as fast, not as successful for the Germans. They don't just simply sweep through, but there is quite some heavy fighting. And it's only in the second phase where they really manage to break them through, you might say, the Allied lines and push them back. But however, what then happens, and if you already mentioned it, the Allies bring forward to reinforcements. And you might say that probably on the 22nd, the morning of the 22nd of February, this attack is pretty much over because the 10th Panzer Division is supposed to launch another attack, and that is stopped dead in its tracks by Allied artillery fire. So the power of Allied artillery, the one thing that the Germans always feared facing the Western Allies, was always the artillery. And here you can again see the effect of that. And when you then look at what that means from the operational point of view, so the bigger picture stuff, and actually it is a failure for the Germans because they do not manage to really break through, to really encircle the enemy forces. And there is a big debate in the high command. And it's actually Rommel who now says, so from the 22nd onwards, and then decided on the 23rd, that continuing this attack here is pointless, because the advance has not been fast enough, has not been quick enough. It's been very difficult to break through. And at this stage, the British are now catching up from the southeast. They are beginning to hit the Tunisia battlefield. They're getting to the defensive line. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Rommel can see, oh God, they're getting into our backs. They're attacking us from the rear now. So there is a big debate between him and Casarine. Casarine says, no, we should keep pushing. In the end, again, it's the Italian High Command, on advice of the Germans, that issues the order that this attack has to be stopped and the troops have to withdraw. Rommel and the others think, even though it's not the great operational victory, it's still a success because it's given the Germans breathing time. They managed to push mainly American troops in this area back by about up to 80 kilometers. So in the stand of that particular theater, that is quite a bit of distance. And they know that the Allies are now, particularly the Americans, are in disarray. As you've already said, the perception of the Allies, particularly the Americans, not particularly high at that stage. So they say they've got a bloody nose. They're out of the fight for quite some time. And it's now time to move to the southeast and to face the British. And it's perhaps also an interesting point when you look at the casualty figures, because this is again where this whole tactical stuff comes in. Of course, I keep saying that while every person gets killed in war is one person too many, but when you look at these casualties here, by the standards of the day, by the standards of other fronts, the Eastern Front, they are still quite low. The Allied casualties are higher. That is unusual. Fighting against the Germans in the Western theatre of war. Normally, the Germans have higher casualties. Here, it's the other way around. There's always different statistics. It's never 100% set in stone. But just to give you a rough idea, so the fighting for Casarine, the Germans lose, roughly speaking, 200 killed, 500 wounded, 252 missing. So roughly about 1,000 people. And they also lost 20 tanks and 14 guns. American losses on the other side were about 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and according to American sources, about 3,000 missing. Now, the vast majority of these, of course, were those who were captured by the Germans. So the final after-action report put together by the Germans on February 24th says that, or reports that they captured 4,026 Allied prisoners of war. And the material losses are quite high on the Allied side as well. So they lose about 180 tanks, 104 half-tracks, and over 200 guns, and about 500 trucks. So that's quite a lot compared to what the Germans lose. But then let's face it, the Germans can't replace their material losses, whereas the Allies can. So again, when you look at this, tactically, beginning not particularly great with the Germans, not as great as many people say what the Germans do. Second phase goes quite well, then runs out of steam. But from an operational point, it's not overly successful. So here's a bit of German bashing for everyone who thinks that I hate the Brits. So now I can hate the Germans too. So you have to get that in. And not everything that the Germans do is always 100% brilliant. I know there is sometimes a bit of an obsession with German tactical operational brilliance. You see a bit of it here, but it could actually are, considering that you've got these very experienced troops, these very experienced commanders against very green American troops. Couldn't they have achieved more?
Well, I'm very glad that you made that point, because that was the note that I had for myself now that I was waiting to interject. Because one description that I think sort of makes sense about the engagement at Casarine Pass is, in a way, it's a double defeat, right? It is an American defeat on the tactical level, but anything above that, the German plan essentially fails. They don't reach their objectives in spite of the advantages that they created for themselves. And partly because of mistakes as well. I mean, Rommel has taken some flack from historians about splitting his force in three. So once they achieve this initial breakthrough at the Casarine Pass, Rommel tries to split his force in three different directions. And of course, that weakens it. It makes it easier for the Allies to slow down each of those three different spearheads and so on. In addition, von Arnim held back some of his tanks. So he didn't actually release as many as he was supposed to. And then he launched a small attack as well at the same time, which failed. But, and here's where we come to the topic of losses that cannot be replaced, 15 of his 19 Tigers are lost in that small failed attack of von Arnim that he just had to launch, perhaps partly for ego reasons, having had to give up many of his tanks to Rommel. So these are the kind of bad decisions that I think our post-war English-speaking world impression of Rommel and the Germans and how brilliant they are, I think we forget about these little mistakes, which are in the end not that little and cost the Germans perhaps their chance at success in this operation. And as far as the Americans are concerned, I think there's quite a reasonable argument that, any army in their situation would have faced these kinds of difficulties. Any army that has not fought this kind of operation before, that has not fought this kind of enemy before, there are going to be officers that don't meet the standard. And of course, that's the case here. The infamous case is a man by the name of Lloyd Fredendall, who performs quite poorly. But given that they were so green, they fought pretty hard and they didn't do that badly, all things considered. So that's my olive branch to our patriotic American listeners out there. I think there's a context required for every defeat as well as for every victory. Now, to get back to the bigger picture, now we'll leave Casarine Pass behind. That Western front is the axis has been stopped. The problem is now that Monty is arriving from the east. And so Rommel shifts his attention towards this defensive line, this Mareth line. And he has fewer means to do this than he ever has before. And one stat that really stuck out at me is that in March 1943, the Axis are supposed to receive what they need is about 140,000 tons of supplies, but they only get 29,000. And that's a pretty serious shortfall. I mean, you can do with a shortage of 10%, a shortage of 15%, a shortage of 25%. But if your shortage is something like 65%, it's going to show on the battlefield. And in that same month of March 1943, the US alone, so not including the Brits, the US alone brings in 400,000 tons of equipment, supplies, and material. So more than 10 times what the Axis is able to bring in. And I think that really sets the stage for this situation now where the Allies are ready to go onto the offensive. Rommel, for example, has only about 160 tanks left. Most of those are Italian, so much smaller, older, much less effective. Whereas the Brits in the 8th Army under Montgomery, they have 800 tanks. And we mentioned the Luftwaffe still being able to play an important role in February, but as time goes by into March, they've exhausted themselves because maintaining an air force is extremely logistically intensive. I mean, just ask the Ukrainians who are receiving, 6 F-16s, and it's a big deal and took months to do, and so on and so forth. So the Luftwaffe is now unable to achieve that local air superiority that it was just 1 month before. So these are the conditions that are in place when we look at, okay, now we're into March and things are going to change. And Rommel, of course, leaves. But I'll leave the details of that up to you, Matthias.
Okay, well, that, of course, is the big change, isn't it? Rommel, the desert fox, leaves the North African plains for the very last time. So what happens? So we now need to shift, as you've already said, to the other part of this particular campaign. So basically towards the southeast of Tunisia. And you already mentioned in the opening statement the Mareth, or if you're British, the Mareth line, which is this old French defensive line, built by the French before the Second World War, more or less on the border to Italian Libya, because there had been tensions, a defensive line. Rommel said of it, well, it is exactly that. It's a French pre-war defensive line with no real military value, but it's there, so they use this. The 8th Army is now advancing. It is quite slow. It is quite methodical. It is Montgomery after all. That's what he does. But they basically start to consolidate in front of this defensive line from around the 17th of February, and then start probing attacks later on, really starting on the 26th. So Rommel looks at this, and as we already said, he realizes that, well, we haven't broken through against the Americans, but we've got breathing time, so we now need to deal with the old enemy, the British 8th Army, that the Germans had encountered a number of times before. So they mass a relatively large force, and they launch Operation Capri, and that's on the 6th of March, 1943. And by the Axis standards of the day, it's a formidable force. So you've got 3 German armored divisions, 2 light divisions, and 9 Italian divisions. And the idea is to really push the British back. This one fails. Again, talking about German or Allied excellence in the field. So here's another failure. And it doesn't work. 55 German or Axis tanks are knocked out. And it's interesting because once this is over, this is when Rommel realizes Tunisia can't be held. He actually flies to the Ukraine, where Hitler is sitting in his headquarters, and he tries to convince Hitler that the bridgehead, so to speak, of Tunisia should be given up, should be evacuated. Of course, he had a very good rapport with Hitler because he had been a very, very close military leader to Hitler. He'd been the personal commander of Hitler's entourage in the early stage of the war. He is the famous Desert Fox. But even he couldn't convince Hitler that it would be a good idea to evacuate the bridgehead, let's call it, and get all these troops back to mainland Europe. Hitler refuses. And he says, well, my dear Rommel, by the way, you do look a little bit tired, so wouldn't it be a great idea if you went on sick leave? And this is exactly what happens. And so Arnim, the person we've mentioned a number of times before, actually takes over, and he now becomes the commander of Army Group Africa. So in some ways, it actually works in the Germans' favor because these tensions in the command structure are gone. But when Rommel disappears, I mean, you can imagine what that means also from a personal point of view, but also propaganda, all these things. So that's a big blow, you might say, also to the Germans fighting there. So they have realized this big offensive there has failed. So it's now going to be an offensive fight. And the British then launched their big offensive, Operation Pugilist, and that is on the 19th to the 20th of March, 1943. Relatively heavy fighting. What happens is that the first phase again doesn't go particularly well. It is quite methodical. The weather is quite bad, so there's rain, which slows down the advance. But in the end, to cut a relatively long story short, the British forces, and that's mainly 10th Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, who then also plays a role in Arnhem later on, he manages to outmaneuver the Axis forces. And as a consequence of that, even though the Axis forces managed to establish a blocking position and to block his further advance, their defensive position has now been unhinged and they start to withdraw. And you can see how important this is, because they now establish a new defensive position about 60 kilometers to the northwest of the Malet line. So that is a long distance in a pocket that is ever shrinking. So you can see this is not really looking good. At this stage, you can really see, even more than before that, when Rommel actually went to Hitler, that this game in the long run is up. You will not be able to hold this particular position, not least because, as you already said, you now have the interdiction from the Allies, supplies not coming in anymore, and that causes a huge, huge problem.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about this Battle of the Mareth line, I find it's interesting, particularly because of the role that's played by that left hook, let's say. So it's called Operation Pugilist. I don't know if this was on purpose, but it's sort of, you have a frontal assault against the line, but then you have a left hook, a wide, sweeping left hook away from the coast that's trying to outflank this line. And in the end, that's one of the maneuvers, as you mentioned, that unhinges that Mareth line position. And we should give credit again, I think, to some troops who don't always get mentioned. We talked about the Brits and the Americans, as especially the British. When we say the British, it's kind of a catch-all term for a lot of other people as well. And there were Indian troops, there were Free French troops under General de Clerc, who later plays a very significant role in France in 1944. His division drives into Paris, for example. And New Zealand troops in particular, they play a very important role in this flanking attack against the Mareth line. So shout out to our Indian, French, and New Zealand listeners. We did not forget your role in turning the Mareth line. Of course, now, as you mentioned, the Axis position, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's kind of a done deal. It's a matter of time. Hitler does have this idea that, we could inflict heavy casualties if we have attritional urban battles in these two port cities of Tunis and Bizerte, but that's just not realistic. I mean, this idea of Festung Tunis or whatever, if I'm inventing the term, but let's say this idea of a brutal attritional battle that costs the Allies, untold of casualties, is just not realistic. And so you have a situation where von Arnim, for example, is outnumbered in terms of the tanks that he has left at this stage in this pocket in northern Tunisia. The Allied tanks outnumber the Axis tanks by something like 10 to 1, approximately, or 9 to 1. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. So you essentially have operations then to squeeze the Axis into a more and more untenable pocket. There are engagements where the Allies have a 30 to 1 superiority in artillery shells fired. So it's a question of time. And then there's of course, this question of evacuation. It's far too late. And Hitler won't even see von Arnim's envoy that he sends to Ukraine to the Führer to say, hey, we really need to evacuate. And by late April is when Hitler allows the evacuation. But by then, they don't have the shipping or the air cover to really make it happen.
And all this leads then to the final outcome, and we all know what that is. And that is, of course, the surrender of the Axis powers in Tunisia. And on the 7th of May, this is when British armor enters Tunis and American infantry from the 2nd Corps enters Bizerte. So these two major ports that you've already mentioned and alluded to. And the moment these are gone and no longer in the hand of the Axis powers, everybody knows the game's completely up. So what started in quite a positive light and was perceived in a positive light by the Axis powers, we can hold this. It's easy to send reinforcements, then to supply this, has now turned into a complete disaster. And 6 days after these two ports are captured, this is basically when the fighting is then completely over. And en masse, the Germans and Italian soldiers then start to surrender to the Allied forces. And the numbers are quite staggering when you look at them. It's quite interesting because even today you don't have the really official number. So most people speak of around 230,000 prisoners of war. This is a very high number, but of course, from the Axis point of view, what is even worse than just the sheer high number is that a large proportion of these are battle-hardened, experienced German troops who are, if that is the right term, probably better fighters than the Italians. So that in itself sent shockwaves through the Axis powers. And this is, of course, also where the term Tunisgrad comes from. So linking it back to the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended in early February 1943. So here you've got two very, very bad, drastic outcomes for the Axis, in particular, in this case, for the Germans. And not only is that a problem, but of course, it really changes the strategic situation because the soft underbelly, as it's called, of Festung Europa, Festung Europe, is now open. So there are no more forces. The North Africa belongs to the Allies. They can choose where they're going to go now. And the Germans and the Italians simply do not have enough troops to cover all of these open flanks because there is a big war going on the Eastern Front. Everybody expects that Sicily is going to be the next step. Also because that might have political implications, but no one really knows. But that then leads to other episodes of this podcast that we still have to do. We already looked at Monte Cassino, which is, you might say, is an indirect consequence of all of this. But this really is the outcome. So in many ways, you might say that the outcome of this particular, let's call it a campaign rather than a battle, is actually more important than the Battle of Stalingrad, which is brutal, it's nasty, but you might say it's one big battle on the Eastern Front. You lose an army, there are lots of other armies fighting there, which sounds awful, but if you play the very cold numbers game of the staff officer, that's what you get. Whereas North Africa, you lose North Africa, it really changes the strategic situation. So it is really big. And when you look at the casualty figures again, when you look at the Allied figures, I mean, they're also quite high. So they lose about 76,000 people. That, by Allied standards, is really quite high. And to a degree, it is because the Americans are not particularly well experienced. They suffer relatively high casualties of about 20,000 men. That is a lot by American standards. But if you put that against the 230,000, because the vast majority of these are, of course, people who are captured as prisoners of war, but it doesn't matter because you've taken them out of the equation. These guys can no longer fight for Germany, the Führer, for whatever they want to fight for, but they are gone. So even this brutal, nasty number game, in the end, works in favor of the Allies.
Yeah, I mean, you have several armored divisions who are surrendering in their entirety. You have the 90th Light Division You have most of the Hermann Göring division. I mean, they're all gone and they're not coming back. And so I think, this campaign, it's not one that gets a ton of press, but it's pretty important in shifting the whole strategic situation in the European theater writ large, so including the Mediterranean. It opens a lot of strategic choices for the Allies as well, and it creates a lot of insoluble strategic problems for the Axis in Southern Europe. And of course, the rest of 1943 and 1944 will show just what happens as a result of all of that. That, folks, was our look at the Tunisia campaign in 1943, a momentous one that allowed us, hopefully, to not offend all of our listeners, again, international listeners, with our assessments of various sides. Matthias wants to get in here.
All of them in equal measure. Then
Yes.
it's okay, isn't
Yes.
it? So we got there by we managed to insult the Germans as well. That's okay then. So that's okay.
We are equal opportunity curmudgeons here on the Both Sides of the Wire podcast. And with that, folks, I'll leave you to chew on our episode for today. If you have any questions, of course, please do send us an email and or leave a comment. Let us know what you thought, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
So Hitler gets the 2 tank divisions with this
Sorry,
plan.
Matthias, you just said Hitler gets the 2 tank divisions.
Does he not? Does he not?
Hitler was not commanding tank divisions in North Africa? My world is blown.
Hitler was then sent on sick leave, and Arnim.
You said Hitler was sent on sick
Hitler
leave.
again. I keep saying Hitler, don't I? Hitler, Rommel, Hitler.
What's the
all
difference?
these southern people. Well, Swabian, Austrians, all the same. There we go.